All right, today we're going to be going through some breathing exercises, I guess, in the form of learning about the breathing. So we're going to be talking about inspiratory and expiratory neurons and their influences, or influencers, I should say. So I want to take a function-based approach to this topic. So first off, we know that the lungs are primarily involved with gas exchange. So primarily bringing in oxygen to the body and expelling CO2 through inspiration and expiration. When we're talking about inspiration, expiration, just in case you don't know, to inspire means to breathe in, or to, I guess, inspire somebody to do something good. So I guess breathing in is a good thing. But also expiration. So expiration date is when something kind of concludes or gets bad. In this case, it means the conclusion of inspiration, which is breathing out. So in order to bring in this oxygen, to expel the CO2, inspiration must occur. And this only occurs when these muscles that allow the chest cavity to expand are contracted. And then these muscles must relax during expiration to expel that CO2. And that's, once again, the relaxation of those muscles. So contraction brings inspiration, relaxation brings expiration. Now, as I'm talking right now, I am voluntarily controlling my breath so that I can bring it out of my larynx and my voice box, my vocal cords, so that I can speak. So I am voluntarily doing this, but at the same time, if you are resting right now, you're watching this presentation, you are involuntarily breathing, most likely, unless you are thinking about your breathing for some reason or another. So there must be neurons that are originating both from these autonomic or the involuntary regions of the brain and the voluntary regions. So that's what we're going to be going through, is this automatic response in breathing and also the voluntary response briefly. So to do this, we have to look at the brainstem, which is usually considered the part of the brain that keeps you alive, even if the other parts of your brain weren't functioning. So we're going to be looking at two main spots, the pons and the medulla. So the medulla will be the first thing that we're going to look towards, and as you can see, it's inferior to the pons. So I like to think of this as the original, the starting point of breathing, and then these are little higher centers that can influence these centers of breathing. So the medulla, I like to think of these as the workhorses. So since they're closer to those inspiratory muscles physically, they're going to be doing the most work to control the breathing complex or breathing process. And then the pons is more of mission control. So if things are going wrong or things need to ramp up, they will be mission control and kind of send signals both to this area and sometimes directly to those muscles to either work faster or slower. And we're going to take a look at all those groups. So first off, the DRG, the dorsal respiratory group, this is found on the dorsal side in the name of the medulla. And these directly innervate the inspiratory muscles. So remember, when the muscles contract, inspiration occurs. So the chest cavity is expanding when these muscles are contracted with response to this DRG. So in other words, when these neurons from the DRG are firing action potentials, these muscles will contract. And this is involuntary, or it's also called quiet breathing because you kind of do it without thinking, and it's quiet, usually through your nose and out through your nose. Now, when these neurons stop firing, inspiration stops. And that's when expiration occurs, because these muscles are just gently relaxing. Think of if you contracted your bicep to bring your hand up towards your shoulder, and then you just let it go, and then it falls down. Those muscles are kind of indirectly expanding or indirectly relaxing, just like when these neurons stop firing, inspiration ceases, therefore you will be exhaling gently. And now I also want to mention that this is connected to the ventral group, which we'll talk about next, to enhance the ventilation during times of need. So these two like to talk to each other to make sure that the inspiratory needs are being met, I suppose. So ventral respiratory group, VRG, V, ventral, means to the front of the body. So obviously this is in the front of the body. And this contains, contrary to the dorsal group, both inspiratory and expiratory muscles. Remember, the dorsal group only has inspiratory, whereas these have both. And this is actually inactive during normal breathing. So these don't really function when you're breathing normally like you will be right now. So right now, your DRG is more activated, where in my case, I'm controlling both my inspiratory and expiratory muscles, so that's being controlled more by higher regions of the brain, which we'll talk about later. This ventral group is activated by this dorsal group once there's an increased oxygen need. This is often during exercise when you just naturally start breathing harder without thinking about it. So when you think about breathing harder or exercising, obviously you don't want passive relaxation of your diaphragm and of your inner or external intercostal muscles. You want them to relax quickly, or in other words, to expire quickly so that you can breathe in again, therefore making a greater, or therefore bringing in more oxygen and expelling more CO2 during times of high demand. So think of the dorsal group as that initial relaxing breathing with inspiration, but then with the ventral group, when it's activated by the DRG, that's when more strenuous breathing will occur. And then we have this pre-Butzinger complex. This is just superior of the ventral group, and just like the SA node controls the heart and controls those rhythmic action potentials that are conducted in the node, these have been found to have some sort of rhythmic action potentials generated to slowly activate these two groups. So if we think about this DRG, it's kind of breathing normally, you know, like there's a rhythm to your breathing, it's calm, it's relaxed, and studies have shown that this PBC complex is innervating those neurons so that they can establish action potentials in a rhythmic fashion, which is really fascinating if you think about it. Just like our heart has to beat about 60 to 70 times per minute in a rhythmic fashion, you have to breathe in a rhythmic fashion, especially so you don't take up a lot of your frontal cortex thinking about your breathing, and you can do it naturally. Now let's move superior. So we're moving to the pons. And these two centers of the pons that we'll look at are the pneumotaxic center and the apneustic center. Apneustic center, sorry, I always pronounce that wrong. Pneumotaxis, when we think about pneumo, we're thinking about lungs. And in taxis, we're thinking about movement usually, so like chemotaxis. In other words, for this case, it's called the regulation of breathing, so the movement of breathing. And the apneustic has to deal with excessive inspiration. If we think of sleep apnea, kind of similar, it's characterized by very labored and struggling inspirations when you start snoring when you breathe in or breathe out. So apneustic is dealing with excessive inspiration. Now, just like last time, the pneumotaxic center is kind of that top superior place, right? So it has control over everything below it. And it exerts this control by halting inspiratory neurons in the DRG. So think about if we're hyperventilating and we're really breathing in too much, this center will stop that inspiratory neuron so that we can actually relax and breathe out, because that's important to keep our body chemistry in check. Whereas the apneustic center prevents these inspiratory neurons from firing. So if we think about it in this way, the pneumotaxic center stops inspiration so that it doesn't get too out of control or the lungs don't expand too far. Whereas the apneustic center prevents these inspirations from stopping, which is kind of an interesting thing. We think about this being kind of bad, right? But if we think about kind of big, deep breaths that we need, sometimes this apneustic center will help in times of stress, so that inspiration can occur more vigorously, I suppose. But this can be overridden by the pneumotaxic center so that these inspirations don't get too out of control. And finally, we're looking at the voluntary control of breathing. So not autonomic anymore, but this is voluntary. This is coming from the motor cortex, and this is the primary thing that's happening right now as I'm talking. So Brodmann's area, we've talked about this in the past, inside of the motor cortex, this is dealing with active movement of your muscles. So obviously, if you want to, you can breathe in actively. You can think about it, breathe in, breathe out. I can do that right now as I'm talking. And there are three theories about how this actually connects from a neuron standpoint. The first one is that these motor cortex neurons from this primary motor cortex directly innervate breathing muscles, so the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles. The second theory is that they indirectly affect it by influencing the activity in both the pons and medulla. So think about this motor cortex going down here to the brainstem, the pons medulla, then influencing those centers in breathing. And finally, the last theory is that these neurons somehow interconnect even further down to these other regions and other neurons that are firing down, somehow affecting these breathing muscles. My guess is that theory number one is probably more accurate because we think about that with like motor functioning in your skeletal muscles. They're directly innervated by those neurons. Whereas in this case, there's kind of a couple different pathways. So it's kind of an interesting thought, but more studies are needed. This was in 2016, and I didn't find anything new on the subject as of 2020, 2021. I just wanted to throw this big diagram in talking about different factors that breathing may have or that other factors may have on breathing. This is a great one over here on the left where it shows the positive versus negative effects on breathing. So if we think about this top group, this would be in the pons respiratory group. This usually has a negative impact on breathing. We remember we were thinking about the halting of inspiration, whereas in all of these groups, they often increase inspiration and expiration, especially when we think about the ventral group, right? So then these connect to those inspiratory muscles, which I have mentioned in the past, diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Whereas on this side, this goes into different presentation that we can talk about later, but we're talking more about those chemoreceptors in this area of the brainstem that either prevent too much breathing or also, I guess, stimulate more breathing based on like exercise and based on higher CO2 levels in the blood. So that's a really good point. If oxygen's decreased, CO2 is increasing, and hydrogen ions are increasing, so the blood's becoming more acidic, it'll trigger a greater breathing rate, right? So that we can breathe faster and get that CO2 out, get the oxygen in. Whereas the central chemoreceptors, also in that same area here in the brainstem, also will allow for more breathing. At the same time, if we look over here to the right, this one's also pretty interesting. Think about if you've ever breathed in something terrible, you know, breathing in like dust, something like that. There are irritant receptors here in this trachea and in the bronchioles that actually prevent more inspiration. That's why, say you breathe in pepper spray, right? And your lungs are like, hey, we don't like that. And so it's going to stop your inspiration. So that's what that negative here is for. It's stopping inspiration. It'll actually induce a coughing reflex where this will really contract and get all that crap out of your trachea. And also another thing is the stretch receptors in the lungs. If they, I guess if the body realizes that the lungs are being too far expanded, which could end up in like some alveolar bursts, this will inhibit more inspiration. Therefore, you will exhale and disallow this lung from being too far stretched. So there's a lot of different things that will exert control over breathing, and I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview before this presentation comes to an end, which is now. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation on breathing and inspiratory, expiratory neurons, and we'll see you next time.